All right, today we're going to have a rough tutorial. I don't know how quick it'll be, but a rough tutorial on macros running on Cisco video codecs. Basically, we're going to talk about what do macros do, how do they work, where can I get an example of one, walk through a couple of examples, how do I connect to the Codecs administrative web browser, then we'll load and edit some touch panel screens and teach you how to load and edit macros onto the codec and then actually run them. So that's it. That's the plan. We'll see how it goes. What do macros do? Macros are code running on the codec that usually run what we call event listeners. They're listening for things to happen. That could be that someone pressed a button on the touch panel, or an incoming call has occurred, or a presentation has begun. The event listener listens for that event, and when it occurs, it fires a message off so that your functions can operate on that event. So if the event was someone pressed the button labeled Apple TV on the touch panel, your function might go in and change the presentation source to match the Apple TV connection. Or if they hit lower the blind button on the touch panel, it might lower the blinds in the room. Your function might set that about. How do they work? Technically, macros are JavaScript code that run xAPI commands. xAPI commands are the API interface to our codecs. So in the past, you've had a serial interface that connects up to the box, and you can send the commands via the serial interface. You can also use a HTTP connection to the box or SSH connection to the box and send the commands that way. Macros are self-contained in the codec itself, so it's running the command on the codec, not some external server. And they actually run literally a JavaScript file, a .js file is loaded onto the codec itself. As a side note, if your macro relies on a button press, a custom button to be created or toggle or switch or whatever on the touch panel, there is an XML, a .xml file that we load onto the codec, and the codec paints the picture of those buttons according to the XML file on your touch panel. Not all macros are going to be based on the touch panel. I'm going to show you one that runs whenever a presentation starts or stops. So there's no button to press on the touch panel. So where can you find example macros? Um, GitHub, the repository that programmers use to co-develop programs, is a good place to go look. There are many places, but Cisco Developer Network or Cisco Devnet has a place on the Devnet site here. I'll link this down in the notes that has a bunch of good examples to get you started. I mentioned the Apple TV earlier. That's one of the sample that they have, and you can literally hook your Apple TV up to an input on the codec, throw away the Apple TV remote because you're going to be able to use the touch panel as the remote control for that Apple TV. The second one here, the audio call dial pad, is nice, where you have people who want to dial, they just want to dial a phone number and they don't want to have to um, use that big keyboard screen. They just want a normal phone looking screen on the touch panel to dial their phone number. Well, audio call dial pad will do that for you. Sometimes you get rooms that are very large and you want to combine the view of two cameras into one view, composite the two inputs. So camera control with wide angle view will let you do that and send that composite view to people on the other end of a call. Launching a customer satisfaction survey is a pretty cool one. So at the end of a call, it just launches a thumbs up, thumbs down. Was this call good or bad? That you can run for a while after you first put in a system typically. Some of the codecs, the higher end codecs, the WebEx Codec Pro, it's a good example, have general purpose IO or GPIO ports. And on those ports, you physically stick a relay, cable from a relay up to that port, and if the voltage goes high, then your macro does one thing. If the voltage goes low, your macro does another. And that's one way we control external devices like lowering, raising blinds, that sort of thing. The next one, smart dual screens, a very common ask. And this is where you're not on a call. So normally you have two screens, and if you're on a call, the left screen might show the video of the people on the other end, and the right screen would show your presentation. Well, if you're not on a call, it'd be nice if both screens showed the presentation. That's what this smart dual screen does. As a matter of fact, if you're on an audio call, it'll show the presentation on both screens as well. We'll go into that one in some detail. Scheduler, perform actions at a certain time of day. Turn the system down, turn the monitor off, whatever. And speed dials, the last one here, is a very common ask as well. How can I set up to dial my personal room or a particular phone number that's dialed often? I want that to just be a button on the touch 10 panel so that it's really quick and easy to dial into it. So let me walk into a couple of these. Let's look at the speed dials first. All right, so this is GitHub. We've gone into room device macro samples, specifically the speed dial sample. For this sample, we're going to create an XML file that has speed dial panel button added to the main page of your Touch 10. If you touch the speed dial panel, it'll pop up this speed dial selector, and we can edit, say, speed dial 1 to have a name, and when you press that name, it'll dial a particular number. So there are two files of importance: the JavaScript file, which is the actual macro, and the XML file, which is the file that defines how to paint the pictures here on the Touch 10. Both of those get loaded onto the codec itself. Let's look at the JavaScript file. It's a very short file. This has got to be hard to read. The first line in a macro is always this constant xAPI definition that says, hey, JavaScript, I need you to require these xAPI functions, and those are on the Cisco video codec already. So all the commands that the codec knows how to do, if you require them in your JavaScript file, you'll be able to reference them here in the macro itself. And in this macro, we have an event listener. That's this xAPI command called event.own. And it's listening for user interface extensions widget action. What that is someone pressed a button. So if anyone presses a button, it signals an event called clicked. A button was pressed that said clicked. And we are matching to say if the button has a ID that starts with SD underscore, and then we don't really care, numbers and letters after it, then we're matching on that. We say, oh, it's one of the buttons, one of those speed dial buttons that we care about. So file this away. We need to make sure in our XML file that defines what the touch panel looks like, those widgets or names of our speed dials have to start with SD underscore. So if it starts with SD underscore, strip that off, look for the number, and here's the xAPI command to actually dial the number that got stripped off there. So simplistic. Now the XML file, it's a little bit longer, but it's not particularly harder, and it's a lot easier to create. You tend to not create these by hand. I'll show you later on how to do this in the editor with a GUI. Makes it a lot easier. But it's just defining a page called speed dials, a row called numbers, and then here are the actual numbers that we're going to dial. We're going to change this SD underscore my number. We're going to change my number to be the phone number that I want to dial, and we'll change my domain to be the domain that your call manager is in. If you're dialing a phone number outbound there. So this could be a regular, 10-digit the ID number, or it could be SIP address, where you replace the whole thing here, which is what I'll do in a demo here in a moment. And you could edit this file, copying and pasting just this section over and over again to add new speed dials pretty quickly and easily. All right, let's look at the second macro here, the smart dual screen. Again, we go to GitHub, Cisco Devnet, room device macro samples into the smarter dual screen presentation. Mr. Nielsen here, who created this, has a nice flow chart, and it says basically a presentation event occurs. It's someone started or stopped a presentation. The macro first looks to see if it's a local presentation or a remote presentation. If it's a presentation coming from the other side, we don't want to change the screens. We want to leave it as is. So if it's not local, false, we're done. If it is a local presentation, then are we stopping an existing presentation or are we starting a presentation? If we are stopping a presentation, then set the monitors back to normal and exit. We're done. If we're starting a local presentation, then are we on a phone call? If we're on a video call, then we again don't want to change the video screen. If we're on an audio call, then we do want to change the screen so that we show the presentation on both screens. And this set output role to override is the mechanism in the macro to actually switch the role. Usually that left monitor shows video from the other end. We're going to switch it to show presentation mode. And what does that look like? Well, there's no XML file because we're not doing anything to the touch panel. There's just this JavaScript macro itself. And the macro starts with a number of constants. I'll explain them in a moment. I'm going to skip to the bottom because that's where the macro kind of really begins. It starts down here with this status on, which is an events listener for conference presentation. It's saying, I have an event listener. I need to know, this macro needs to know if someone starts or stops a presentation. When that event fires, we're going to run this check preso state function. And here it is, check preso state. So we run the function and we look first to see if this is a local presentation or a remote presentation. If it's a local presentation, then are we starting it or stopping? This ghost means I'm stopping a local presentation. If I'm stopping a local presentation, then just set the role of the monitor back to its normal show a video from the other end mode. Else, if it's in sending mode, that means I just started a local presentation. And I need to find out, okay, I started a local presentation, but am I on a video call at the moment? And I find that out by using this get video call state function, which is up a little higher. So here's get video call state, and it finds out whether or not we're on a phone call. If we are on a phone call that's a video call, we don't change anything. If it's an audio call, then change to override, meaning take that left monitor and make it presentation mode only as well. And that's it. It's actually fairly complex for macro for me. That's about as big a macro as I can handle. Okay, so we've had examples of a couple of macros. So now, how do we connect to the web browser on the codec to begin with to load these things and edit them? If the codec is on-premise registered to your local call manager, you're going to browse to the IP address of the codec. You just go in your browser, type in the IP address, and it'll ask you for login credentials. The default here is admin with no password. If the codec is cloud registered, you're going to need a favor. You need someone who has access to your organization's Cisco Control Hub, and they're going to make that device available for management by browser, and they need to add you as a person who is allowed to manage this device. Let me actually go in and show that. I'm going to log into Control Hub. So this is Cisco Control Hub. First, we want to look at places and the place name of where the particular device is. I have an SX80 in a place called Berry Farms. I click on that device, scroll down on the right here to the bottom where it says Device APIs Access, View Edit Access. And this tells me that admin and Paul Van Ray are authorized to access this device's API. Once I've defined who has access to the device's API, I can then go to the device itself, scroll down to the bottom here where it says Device Web Portal, and actually launch a web portal into the device itself. It will sign you in automatically, excuse me here. So if it was on-prem registered, you would see the same screen if you log in directly to the IP address of the device. And the real caveat here is when you log into it this way from Control Hub, your laptop needs to be on the same network as the device you're managing. So this device happens to be at my house, and I'm at my house. If I were on VPN without split tunneling, I wouldn't be able to reach this device, and it would time out and fail at this point. So just be aware of that. You need to be on the same network as your device. And I'll give you a little tip. If you do get that favor from your Control Hub admin and he or she gets you to this point, the first thing you want to do is go into Security, Users, and add your own username as a new user that has ability to do room control, integrator, basically all the functions you want here. But add that user because at this point, I can now not bug my Control Hub friend. I can log directly into this device, even though it's registered to the cloud. I now know its IP address, and I can log in with this username password to get to this screen. Hope that makes sense. So, how do you go in and create these touch panel screens? I'm going to show you on the web-based editing section on the codec under integration and user interface extensions editor how to do this. The configuration that you create, whether you do it offline or via this online editor, will eventually store that configuration on the codec itself. You can edit that XML file to add new buttons, add new screens, however you want separately, but you're going to come back and import it here to store it on the codec. You can store it on other codecs and have some consistency between codecs so that users know exactly where to go to get the button every time it's the same on each codec. So it is nice to create a standard XML file that you move from codec to codec. So let me do a demo. I'm going to show you here how to bring in one of those files. We go to integration on the right, user interface extensions editor. And this brings us into the configuration editor where we could go to new and create one on the fly. I'm going to cheat, go up in the upper right hand corner here and import an existing XML file. We're going to take the speed dial macro and get its XML file that defines those screens on the touch panel. So I can double click on the name and put my name there, say my personal room. And since I've clicked on this widget on the right, I can see the widget ID. Remember that that macro strips off everything after SD underscore, and that's what it's dialing. Oops. That's what it's dialing when you press that button. So we'll put my personal room right here. All right, if I'm not making any other changes, I can hit the up arrow and it will export that configuration over to my video system. How do I know that's been done? Let me go to maintenance, user interface screenshots. Take a screenshot of the touch panel. In a moment, it'll come up and show you what I can see. So there we go. Now the speed dial panel is on my Touch 10, wasn't there before. Also, let me take another screenshot. If I click that button, you now see Keller Personal Room on the touch panel as well. If I actually press that button, it will go out and dial. I don't want to show that, but it will go out and dial my personal room. So again, interface, user interface extensions editor is where we went to create these speed dials. Here's a trick. In the right-hand corner, the hamburger icon, come down to download the editor. This editor can be downloaded on your laptop so that you can create, edit, alter, mess with these configurations on your laptop without being registered to a codec. You don't have to do this live on the codec. You can do it from your Mac or your PC in your leisure time without connecting onto there. So download the editor right here allows you to do that. It just runs a HTML file and runs in a browser on your laptop, but it will edit and create these files for you. Then later on, when you log into this on a codec, you can import that file like I just did here and push it to the codec itself. All right, so we loaded the touch panel, but that just added buttons. Buttons don't do anything unless there's a macro that defines an event listener and something to do when the event fires. So here's macro editor. Waking up hamsters, hadn't seen that before. We could create a new macro from scratch, or we can cheat like I like to do and import from file. Here's our speed dials JavaScript. Open that. So it looks familiar. There's not really anything we need to do to change it. But now we have a macro defined, and it's got a little asterisk there telling us it hasn't been saved yet to the video system. Boom, it's been saved. And if I look at this wrench icon now, I can save this to another file. Maybe it already existed on this system and you wanted to make a copy of it on your laptop. I can enable it, or here delete it, but by enabling it, you do have to enable it to get it to run on your system. And the first time you go into this, you may get a message pop up saying macros are not enabled on the codec itself. Do you want to enable them? So click yes. There's an overall system toggle for running any macros at all that has to be enabled. It'll tell you if you need to do that. But I can see that this is running, and I can see down below in the console that we have started macros and they've loaded, there's no errors, and it's ready to go. So now if I reach over to my speed dial panel and watch the bottom here, if I click speed dial panel and Keller personal room, it dials into my personal room, ends the call, and there are no log messages, so we don't see anything down there. All right, no fun. You always want to put some logging messages in here. Those show up down here in the console and let you know, particularly as you're debugging the macro itself, it'll let you know how things are going and how it ran. So, bummer. If I look at the history here, I can see the past macros that have run as well and what happened with them. Lastly, I just want to leave this comment. I'll put this in the notes below as well, but there is a nice macro scripting tutorial that will kind of take you a little deeper into macros and how to get certain things done in a macro. So good link. It's from our Devnet guys as well. There's lots of training out there, but this is a good starting point. All right, that's it. That's my rough example of macros on the Cisco video codecs. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.